Hi, this is Kevin Wilson of the Urban Homesteading School in Powell River on the west coast of Canada. Today's topic is soil basics, and we're going to talk about what soil is, how to test your soil, find out what you've got, and how to improve your soil and build more soil. So first of all, let's talk about what soil actually is. People who are not gardeners or farmers quite often see soil as just dirt. It's sort of inert stuff that we stand on, holds plants up, and that's all it does. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that. The more scientists study soil, the more they find out about the complexity of the processes inside it and the physical structure and biological structures. So basically with soil you've got your physics, you've got your chemistry, and you've got your biology. From a physical structure point of view, sand and silt and clay and organic matter make up soil, and different soils have different proportions of those things. And your garden soil actually might be different from one bed to another depending on what things you've added to it in the past, what's been grown in it in the past, and different parts of your yard, like your lawn or so on, they will have different soil structures too. So when you're thinking about working with your soil, you've got to be quite specific about where you're doing it, which actual area of soil and kind of soil you're going to be working with. Soil that's been around for a while, it's not brand new off the truck. It has a structure, a crumb structure, where the physical constituents like the sand and the clay and the organic matter join together into crumbs which hold water. Just sand or just clay is not going to do a very good job with water. Sand doesn't hold it at all, hardly. You get a little film on the outside of the sand particles, and the rest of the water that's applied just runs straight through and out the bottom. That's what my soil is like. Clay holds water really tightly, so it will soak up a lot of water, but it won't do it very fast. So it takes a long time for it to get wetted down properly if it's dry, or to dry out if it's wet. So you don't have to water it as often, but you water it more deeply. With sand, you don't put too much water on at a time, but you have to do it more often. Water and soil are very intimately connected. There is a water cycle where the water moves through the soil and through the rest of the environment in a continuing cycle over and over again. So let's think about when it rains, water falls out of the sky. Isn't that amazing that it does that? And hits the ground, soaks into the soil, and is taken up by the organic matter, particularly in the soil, but also clay and other minerals that will soak it up. It soaks into the soil until the soil has got as much as it can hold, and then it leaches out of the bottom. So your soil may be lying on top of sand or bedrock or other forms of mineral, and the water can slide down into those areas as well, and down into places that hold water like aquifers, so that we can pump it up again through wells. But without our man-made wells, the water does actually come up again, because plant roots take it up. The plants bring the water up through their stems. That's what actually holds the stem up in a green plant, not a tree or a shrub. And then they transpire it out through the leaves into the air. So then you've got the water, the moisture going out into the air, building up into clouds and raining again. That's a pretty simple cycle there, but the water cycle is actually a good deal more complicated. It goes off into other places, does other things, comes back, but it always goes round and round and round. So your job when you're building better soil is to help your soil hold that water and let it out to the plants as needed. You would like to avoid standing water on top of the soil. You'd like to avoid the water running straight through the soil and leaching out the nutrients. You want something that's going to hold on to the water in your soil and then allow that water to go back to your plant roots. And that something generally means organic matter. From the point of view of chemistry, this is where the NPK numbers that you see on fertilizer bags at the store come in. N stands for nitrogen, P is for phosphorus, and K is for potassium. And when you buy a fertilizer, whether it's organic or synthetic, it will have on the bag the proportions of those elements that are in it. As well as NPK, there is a lot of other nutrients that your soil can hold and that your plants need. And sometimes some soils are deficient in particular things or have more than that's needed. And before you start adding more nutrients, whether it's NPK or micronutrients, you really need to know what's already there. It's a waste of money and time to be adding stuff that you have plenty of. And if you have a big deficiency of something, you might need to add more than normal. Those nutrients are in the soil in several different ways. One of them is directly dissolved into the soil moisture so that plant roots can take it up immediately in that way. Now all those nutrients, NPK and the micronutrients, are held in soil in several different ways. One of the ways is directly dissolved in the soil moisture, and plant roots can access those nutrients directly. But those nutrients dissolved in soil water are also very prone to leaching. If it rains, a lot of that nutrient solution is going to get washed away with the water coming down from the sky. So we don't really want to have all our nutrients dissolved in moisture. The rest of the nutrients in the soil are held both attached chemically to soil particles, especially clay particles. They're really good at holding on to nutrients. But the other way is actually built into the bodies of all the micro herd that's in your soil. All the organic matter, both vegetable and animal. There's a huge variety and number of microorganisms running around in your soil that you never really notice. Even if you look at them through a magnifying glass, while you can see the smaller animals, you can't see the microbes and the bacteria that are in there. And all of those creatures are holding nutrients in their bodies, and as they die, of course, those nutrients become available again and get dissolved into the soil moisture, and they get eaten up by other creatures and run through the whole cycle again. You want lots and lots of life in your soil to be holding all those nutrients. And some of those creatures directly exchange nutrients with plant roots, especially fungi. So it's important to have a good variety and spread of different microlife in your soil. So there's all these different aspects to soil. How do you find out what you've got in the way of soil in the place where you're going to be growing plants? So if you're going to test your soil, first of all, you have to take a sample, whether you're going to send a sample to a lab or do some testing on your own. And we'll head out into the garden and take a sample of the soil in one of my backyard vegetable beds. So here we are on one of my beds in my backyard garden, and I've taken a trowel and just scraped off the top layer of small rocks, bits of organic matter and so on, so that we're just getting soil in our sample. Now we'll dig a small hole. It needs to be about 6 to 8 inches deep. What you're trying to do is take your sample from about 2 to 6 inches below the surface. So ideally, once you've got your little hole dug like this, you can take a slice off the side of the hole and take that as your sample. Now, in some soils which hold together well, you'll be able to take a slice that holds together. For me, it just collapses into the bottom of the hole, so I can't accurately take a slice off the side of the hole. I just have to take what I can get. And I've just dropped that into a nice clean yogurt pot there, so there's nothing to contaminate the soil with stuff from elsewhere. It's a really good idea to use clean containers and a clean trowel to take your sample so that you're not introducing anything from outside the soil. This sample's still damp. I've got another one drying, which we'll look at later for one of the other tests. But for this test, I'm just going to use a jam jar full of water. And what this does, it will let you see visually, and you can also measure how much sand, silt, clay and organic matter you've got in your soil. So I'm going to open this jar. I'm just going to put it down. And we'll take just a teaspoonful of soil sample. Maybe a couple of teaspoonfuls. Put the lid on and give it a really good shake. You want to break up any clumps that are there and make sure all the different components are separated out into their individual little grains and granules. And once you've given it that good shake, then you're going to put it to one side and let it set so that everything can settle. Now, I'm already seeing sand settling to the bottom of this. There's a 1/4 of an inch of sand on the bottom already. But we'll take another look at that when the soil sample is settled completely and we can see the layers. What we'll get is sand on the bottom, any silt will be in the next layer, any clay will be in the next layer, and then on top will be organic matter particles floating. Now, because my soil is very, very sandy, I don't expect to see hardly anything at all in the silt and clay layers here. And clay will actually float around in the water for hours and hours and hours. If you've got really fine clay particles, they can stay suspended for 24 hours. So, particularly if you've got clayey soil, you might have to let this sample settle for a day or even 2 days to get a good, accurate measurement. So, just let it settle till this top layer is as clean and clear as possible. Now, in some countries particularly, it's very easy and cheap to get soil lab tests, and if you've got that available to you, then you should definitely take advantage of it. They will give you a lot more detail and more accurate numbers than you can get by using one of the soil sample tests that you can buy in a gardening store. But, you know, if you're going to be paying $100 for testing on a soil sample and you want to do more than one test because you have more than one area that you're interested in, that starts to get a bit expensive. So you can buy test kits at garden centres which have tiny chemicals in them in little capsules and little jars, all special sized, and you can get a not terribly accurately quantitative idea of what nutrients are in your soils and the pH. Basically, they're going to give you an idea, do you have enough, too much, or too little? You're not going to get accurate numbers. So let's look at doing some home soil tests. I'm going to show you the pH one. The other nutrient ones like nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus are very similar, so we don't need to do all of them. So what you get is some kind of container. Now this one's just a little plastic box, and it has a colour gradient here and a place here where we're going to put some soil and a measured amount of water, mix it up with chemicals from the capsules that come inside. See a little bag of capsules in there? They're just like this, green. Add those chemicals, shake it all up, let the colour develop, and then compare the colour to what's on the side here, and that'll tell you what pH soil you have, approximately. So let's go through that process. Here's my soil sample. This is a dried up one, and you can see there's a few big rocks and so on in there. What we're going to do is just avoid the rocks, take a broken up sample as far as possible, and you can see how very sandy that soil is. And we'll put that in the bottom of the container. So what we've got to do is add this soil sample up to the marked line. A little bit more. Okay, that's a tiny bit too much, so I'm just going to empty out a little bit off the top. There we go. Okay, that's better. So the reason for drying that sample is mostly to make it easier to handle. Once it's dried up, it's much easier to break it up into very small crumbs, powdery texture, and get it into here. If it's damp and it's all holding together in chunks, it's really hard to get it in here, and it's very hard to get a consistent amount in here. So dry it first. So once we've got the soil in here, then we need to break open this capsule and empty it in here. So I'm going to hold the join over the top and just open it up gently so that what's in the capsule goes down into the soil area. We'll just squeeze it a bit so that all the little bits come out of the back end. Make sure we've got everything from the other side as well. There we go. Okay, so now we've got soil up to here, chemicals up to here, and we're going to add water up to here. So here's my water. Gonna have to get a bit more. There. To get it as close to the lines marked on here as possible, but this is not accurate lab science anyway, so if you're a tiny bit off, it's going to make a qualitative difference, but it'll manage. So let's put the lid on here and shake the whole thing up. Okay, so that sample has sat for a minute or two and it's pretty well settled out, so we can see the colour, and I've got it against the white sheet there so that you can see it without interference from colours in the background. And what we can see there is that we're in between slightly acid and acid for that sample. Slight acid they have as pH 6.5, acid as pH 6, and we're closer to the slight acid, so probably about 6.3, 6.4, something in that region. What that tells us though is that we're in a good region there for vegetable plant growth, because most of our garden vegetables like things slightly on the acid side. Potatoes like it quite acid, but other vegetables mostly slightly on the acid side, with some exceptions, of course. Things like brassicas, all our cabbage crops, they prefer it to be slightly on the alkaline side. So we often add lime, like calcium carbonate, lime, ground up limestone, to the soil to increase the amount of calcium in there for them and to move it towards the alkaline rather than acid side. But generally this is a really good basis. Now, different soils have different acidity levels. Here on the west coast of Canada, we have a lot of rain in the winter, and that washes away many of the free ions in the soil moisture. So that's why we end up with acidified soil, because all our alkaline ions are washed away during the winter. So how do you improve your soil or build more soil if you don't have enough? And we never really have enough. It partly depends on the kind of soil you're starting out with. You've just done some tests, so you know whether your soil is sandy or clayey or silty or a mixture. A mixture is good. If you have sand, then one of the things you want to do is add organic matter to hold on to the water so it doesn't disappear by leaching straight through your soil, taking your nutrients with them. If you've got clay soil, then it wants to be broken up and opened up by adding, guess what, organic matter. Pretty much any soil can be improved by adding organic matter to it, unless it's already very largely organic matter in the first place, which does sometimes happen if you've built soil from scratch using things like sheet mulching and so on. The soil that you end up with can end up with a lot of organic matter and not all that much mineral in it. But generally speaking, if you've got ordinary soil, it's soil that's in the ground, you haven't built it yourself from scratch, then adding organic matter to it is going to improve it whatever you do. Another thing is good to add to your soil to improve it, and which often comes along with organic matter, is soil life. Now, if you're buying bagged manure or compost or whatever from the store, that's not going to have hardly any life in it. It's been sterilized. But if you're making your own compost, then that will have a lot of soil life in it. And you can also use compost to make compost tea and then sprinkle that over a wider soil area, and that will introduce microorganisms that were in the compost. You're not going to get obviously bigger life, but microorganisms, yeah, they will come along for the ride, and then they'll start to grow in your regular soil just as they did in the compost. You might also need to add nutrients to your soil. Now, people used to think about this, that basically it was just add some of the NPK and maybe a few smaller nutrients, and so that they will be in solution in the soil moisture, and you're done. But we know now that that's not the optimal way to do it. That what you want to do is feed the soil, feed all the creatures in the soil, and they will hold on to those nutrients until the plants need them, instead of them getting washed away because they're dissolved in the moisture. So what might be missing from your soil? Well, hopefully you've been able to do a bit of testing to find out, do you have high or low levels of various nutrients? And the things that might be missing are things that are missing from your subsoil and bedrock. You know, the soil that you have in your yard, unless it's been imported from somewhere else, it's formed from the subsoil and the rocks that are in the layers below. Now that's not always the case. There's at least 5 feet of plain sand underneath my yard, which I know from having dug holes for fence posts and so on. And there's very, very little nutrients in sand like that. So even if my plant roots are going down 5 feet, they're not going to be bringing much from down below. That's different if you have a more normal bedrock where you've got actual rocks down below that are being broken up by the natural processes, and the components from them can be brought up by plants' roots. So what kinds of things might you add to your soil to add organic matter and nutrients? Well, almost all gardeners know about compost. Compost wants to be, if you pile up organic matter in a corner, it will become compost. But your own compost is always great to add back into the garden beds. If you want to take a good deal of time and effort and do things like turning the pile every few days or every week or every 2 weeks, you will get better compost with more nutrients in quicker. But you're doing the work of turning the compost. So it swings and roundabouts. You can just do the pile up everything in a corner and let it turn into organic matter at least, even if it won't have a whole lot of nutrients left in it. It will have, because it never really heats up properly, it will have weed seeds in it. It might have disease spores in it. So again, there's your swings and roundabouts. You can also buy compost either in bags at most of the grocery stores and big box stores and garden stores have bagged manure and compost at this springtime of year. And that's not bad stuff. It's been sterilized, so it's not going to bring anything in the way of soil life in, but it should have plenty of organic matter and at least some nutrients. Next thing is manure, and there's all different kinds from all different animals. You can buy it in bags at the store. If you live in anywhere near a rural area, it can be available. You know, people who have livestock may make it available. Sometimes there's so much you can get it for free. Sometimes you have to go and shovel it yourself. Sometimes people will bring it and you'll pay them for it. But much local manure is going to have weed seeds in it, horse manure especially. The other thing it might have in it is medications that the animals have been given, again horses particularly. So if you're worried about that, check with your source, see what they've been using on their horses. Worm castings are a kind of manure. They're just worm poop, and they're an excellent addition to the soil. Most people don't have a lot of them, because even if you have your own worm farm, you know, they don't produce a huge amount at a time. So sometimes it's better to focus something special like that on your potting soil or containers or places where you want something especially good for a special plant. Chicken manure is extra strong. It has more nitrogen in it than most animal manures. So you need to be careful about how much you apply and where you apply it. Don't put chicken manure right round tender plants. There's also something called green manure, which doesn't mean green poop. What that is plants that are grown in order to put nutrients back in the soil. You can grow plants on any spare area of your yard or garden or land that you have. It doesn't have to be a field of waving grain kind of thing. You know, if you grow, say, clover on an area next to the driveway and mow it every now and again, then all those nice nitrogen-rich clover cuttings can go as a mulch on your soil or into your compost pile. People who have space sometimes dedicate a certain area of ground to just growing green manure crops, either to go on the garden beds that they're using for plants or into the compost pile. You can also grow green manures right where you want to use them. The biggest difficulty I've found with green manures is incorporating them into the soil, partly because it takes time for that to happen. You know, as you chop them down or turn them in, you've then got to allow at least several weeks for the soil microbes to do their job and start breaking them down. You can't plant straight into them. But just also the physical work of turning them in can be an issue. So if you want to use green manures like that on your active beds, read up on what works best for your location, because different kinds of green manure crops die off at different times, grow well at different times in different locations, and how you're planning to incorporate them into the soil afterwards. You know, ideally you want to be able to just knock them down, have them die over the winter, and let the soil creatures themselves do the turning in and the incorporating for you. But sometimes you end up having to do it mechanically. Grass clippings you might not think of as a green manure, but you know, if you're cutting grass from one location and then putting the grass clippings on another location, it's the same kind of concept. And grass clippings are actually quite high in nitrogen. You don't want to pile them too high if you're mulching an area with them, because they'll get hot as they break down. About 2 inches is about the most you want to do as a layer of fresh grass clippings. You want to be careful where they're coming from. Are the people who are giving you their lovely grass clippings, are they using chemical fertilizers or even worse, herbicides on their lawns? Because you don't want that in your vegetable beds. And the thing that I'm not wild about either is dog poop in the grass clippings. So I prefer not to use that kind of grass clippings. Other kinds of organic mulch, the other big one is leaves. If you live in a place where you've got lots of deciduous trees around and you can get leaves, those are excellent for either just mulching the soil with over the winter, incorporating into your compost. They make really good compost. They also make leaf mold, which is basically just leaves, and you put them in some kind of a container where they will stay moist, and you put them to one side for a year or 2 or 3, and the fungi which are already on the leaves will break them down into something that acts and looks very like peat, kind of brown, fibrous, holds water. You can use it in potting soil, you can use it in the rest of your soil. Great stuff, and free. Wood chips have some pros and cons from the point of view of building organic matter. You know, eventually they will break down and become organic matter, and that's a good thing. The thing is that they do take quite a while to break down, and that they need nitrogen in order to do that breaking down. So if you actually mix them into your soil, they're going to take nitrogen from whatever's in the soil already and use it for their own breakdown. And they will take several years to actually break down even in the soil. So it's not a terribly good idea to mix them in. What you can do is pile them up and let them rot on their own. Especially if you add some nitrogen like urine to the pile, they will break down quite nicely and give you some good organic matter compost. And the other point is to use them on top of the soil, especially if you've got things like trees, shrubs and other kinds of perennials where you're not continually disturbing the soil like you would be with annuals. Mulching with wood chips won't do the soil any harm. It will keep it nice and moist, and eventually they'll break down into the soil. People worry about it taking nitrogen from the soil in that kind of situation. Apparently what actually happens is that you get a little bit of nitrogen take up in the interface where the wood chips are piled on top of the soil, but below that very top layer it doesn't affect the plant roots or the take up of nitrogen at all. So it's really not a problem. Go nuts. For some things then you want to be adding minerals to your soil. You know, if you've got very acid soil, then people often add limestone to the soil, which adds calcium, and sometimes adds magnesium if you're using dolomite lime, and it makes the soil less acid, moves it more towards neutral. Dolomite lime is good to use occasionally, but not every year. The thing is, your soil does need some magnesium along with calcium, but it doesn't need it in the proportion that dolomite lime provides. So if you're adding dolomite lime every year, then you're adding more magnesium than your soil needs. And if it builds up in the soil, it can actually cause the soil to become crusted and kind of tough. So it won't break up very easily. So you don't want that to happen, obviously. So most of the time, you should be using limestone that's non-dolomite. 2 other minerals that often get added are granite dust, which has a lot of different nutrients in a ground up form that the acids and so on in the soil can attack and get the nutrients from. And the other one is wood ash. If you have a wood stove or a wood fire and you use it regularly, you're going to have a supply of wood ash by the end of the winter. That, you know, do you want to put it in the garbage? Not really. It's good for chicken dust baths, but it can also go on your soil, especially if you've got acid soil. Then wood ash provides quite a bit of calcium and potassium, as well as bringing the soil back to neutral. And when you're adding all these things, you don't necessarily need to dig them in. In fact, in the way of organic matter particularly, you're probably better off just leaving it on the soil surface, and then the worms and the other soil creatures will incorporate it into the soil for you eventually. It can take them a while. So if you're wanting to plant very soon after you apply your additions, then you may want to mix them in so that the soil's more homogeneous and less chunky. So this has been Soil Basics, and we've looked at structure of soil, chemistry of soil, how to test your soil and find out what you've got and what you can do to improve it. If you've got any questions, please post them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them.